So this is a point that I've made or attempted to make many times in the past, and this is the point that the 2010s is a new 1980s. And I know that there are going to be certain people watching this who are either from the 1980s or who are not from the 1980s. And if they're not from the 1980s, there'll be these sorts of weird, fetid douchebags or douche girls that sort of fetishize the 1980s and think, no, wasn't it brilliant? Isn't like 80s stuff brilliant? Isn't it all wonderful and glittery in 80s? And isn't like glam or like whatever like weird outfits rock stars wore back then, wasn't it all brilliant and all that sort of shit? And I have to say that like no, 1980s actually wasn't brilliant. It was a time of austerity and conservatism and political correctness, all this shit that people hate. And I've just been watching Quentin Tarantino talk about films from the 90s versus films from the 80s, and talking about how, yeah, the 80s was this era of political correctness. And also, famously, as I pointed out also on different videos in the past, which you can find on my channel, terrible, terrible, terrible films, largely, I think. And then in the 90s, you have this beautiful sort of reaction to all these terrible, horrible films from the 80s, and you get yet again a new era of cinematic genius, dominated in part at least by the great man who was Quentin Tarantino. And fantastic new films being produced, wonderful, wonderful pieces of genius getting made at last again. Because back in the 70s, you have great genius movies, as we all know, great, as Tarantino said, very cynical films also from the 1970s. And then in the 80s, sorry, you got everyone needing to be a sort of like a lovable character and a good guy and all this sort of thing. And it existed in this horrible sort of fantasy land where nothing, like, well, nothing sort of like bad. I was going to say nothing bad happens to anybody, but where no one's really a bad person, if you sort of see what I mean. And everyone's a sort of a good guy, jolly chap, really. And prior to that, in the 70s, you have gritty realism like Apocalypse Now, Easy Rider, and Taxi Driver. I don't know. All those were great 70s films. So, yeah, and my contention is that the 2010s being a sort of a neo 80s, very much dominated by political correctness, very much dominated by conservative social attitudes, is basically mimicking the 1980s. It's got everything. It's got hipsters in it, hasn't it? It's got awful fashion, horrible films. It's the same shit, a different day. And I think underlying all this, there's some very sort of deep socioeconomic set of causes behind it, such as like austerity causing people to become more conservative. And this has been documented, I think, by sociologists throughout history. And it's, yeah, ends up producing grim films. And then before the 1970s and 60s, you have the 50s, where exactly the same sort of thing was going on. Crap, and by the way, expensive crap being produced in the name of, well, like McCarthyism and anything that smacks like a sort of communist attitude. That was akin to the sort of the political correct. That was the like the political correctness of the 1980s, of the 1950s. Their version of political correctness was McCarthyism. Sorry, just saw that I had a bit of egg coming out of my mouth just then. Slightly disgusting, isn't it? But yeah, it and just from my perspective, like the worst decade I've ever had to live through has been the 2010s, and I lived through most of the 90s. I was born in '93, and I remember that being pretty all right. I didn't really remember much of it, so I would have liked to have known the 90s better, frankly. And I love the 90s because it's the decade that produced me. I like me a lot. I think I'm good. I think I'm positive. Then you had another decade, the 2000s, full again of wonderful, fantastic films, brilliant, brilliant cinema. Uh, music, yes, I don't think the music was so brilliant. Yeah, maybe there's something in that because actually 80s music, in my opinion, was rather good. 70s music, but then again, 60s and 70s music was also brilliant. And I think I've mentioned this before that there's not really a sort of trade off in terms of music versus, and then 90s and 2000s music was also brilliant or great. It's just that maybe I didn't like the music of the 2000s too much. So I was looking back to sort of the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, and I was like comparing it to all that stuff. I didn't think it was as good. But then again, my favorite band, Fleet Foxes, they're from the 2000s. So I suppose I'm wrong. And yeah, but it's just in terms of films, I think. And when films get really bad, it's conspicuous in the 80s. It's conspicuous in the 2010s. And there'll be some people out there who are like bearded hipsters and all politically correct and everything else, and or SJW types waving placards and so on. So, no, 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 it's brilliant in the 2010s. We got to wave placards and stuff. It's like, yeah, you were doing that just for fun. You didn't really believe it. You're doing it because you got a kick out of it for some reason, I reckon. So it's not like, you were really sincere about what you were believing in. It's just that you wanted to wave placards and shout. And living in a time of Tory austerity in Britain, just like in the 1980s. And this is it. It follows from periods of political austerity, or political economic austerity, I should say. The political system imposes austerity on the economy, growth slows, people lose their jobs, not enough good films get made, not enough people are actually out there writing good films and trying to write good films, great movies, I should say, or whatever. And the culture sort of slows and stultifies and sort of crumbles and cracks, like shit getting into the mix, cracks, like shit getting into the mix quite often, I think. And the shit that gets into the mix sort of treatment either because it's politically correct, because it toes some sort of political line, or it's just a case that they have nothing better to put out there. You know what I mean? Um, I'm really struggling for examples of films. I'm not going to do examples of films from the 2010s. That's not really what I want to talk about. But could I say the new Star Wars? Yeah, maybe I could actually, because the new Star Wars films, those were films which I dearly, dearly wanted to love. I didn't want to like them. I wanted to love them. And really, what they ended up doing is like, okay, you got a female lead, no problem, fine. But it was a bit forced. That's all. It was a bit. It was like too much of an act of appeasement. I feel. I mean, from Leia from the 70s. Um, Also a lead character. The male lead, happened to be her character's brother. They kissed. Oh god. Um, yeah. Do you know what I mean? It's like that. And then in the follow-up prequel trilogy, they didn't have a female lead. They didn't even they didn't have a female lead at all. It was just all blokes. So it was like, well, they had Padme, who was like the sort of love interest. She was badass. And then they have Ray, and Ray was, yeah, really badass, but also like, well, a little bit too badass. But then it doesn't make sense because she's a Palpatine, I suppose. It just doesn't make sense of her being that badass and a lovable character, I have to say. Um, Maybe those films weren't as bad. I didn't want to use examples because because that was going to be the first example that I thought of, and maybe I don't want to think of examples, but there were loads of examples of trick. And maybe I don't want to think of examples, but there were loads of examples of trick. I've done videos about this before, so it's not actually all that necessary. Like the sequel trilogy, I did. There's some very, very cool bits in it. But yeah, I'm glad to be out of the 2010s, but because of COVID, it still feels like it's the 2010s because of like COVID austerity and the fact that the 2010s did COVID to us. I don't know like how to get out of it, how to get out of this 2010s rut we're in, this rut of austerity. And if Labour doesn't become too fucking reactionary and politically correct, but I suspect they probably are under Keir Starmer, but I'm none of that's going to vote Labour because it's what a Labour Party vote really signifies. The only thing, frankly, it signifies is a vote against the Tory Party, and that's why people should vote Labour. This is the only reason to vote Labour. It's it's like none of the other political parties, the Green Party, the Lib Dems, none of those are going to get into power. If it's the Lib Dems, they're not going to meaningfully get into power. They're only going to get into power the Conservative coalition, or maybe even a Labour, a Lib Lab coalition, maybe to help Labour get into power. But no, you can't vote for those parties. You've got to vote for one of the big political parties, Conservative or Tory. Sorry, Labour or Tory. Those are your choices here. It might be all very, very nice to vote Green and so on, but it's ineffective. And that is how it works. If you don't vote Labour, the Conservative, better than the Tories, honestly. But so many people get hoodwinked by right wing attitudes that they all turn into little snotty scumbag Tory types. I know I say that, but I'm not snotty. Not in my soul. In my nose, I am. It's the sort of thing you have to explain to people from the 2010s because they take things at face value. Anyway, this is my bit of assertion over, I think, just for now. I'm going to say bye bye. I love you lots. Bye, everyone. Love you.